On a summer day in 1848, 5 progressive women sat at a kitchen table in Seneca Falls, New York, and made the bold decision to invite many activists of the day, mostly women, to a 2-day convention to discuss women's rights. At the assembly, Elizabeth Cady Stanton laid the foundations of suffrage movement in her Declaration of Sentiments. What followed was one of the most significant civil rights battles in our nation's history, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, granting women the right to vote. The year was 1920. Although numerous men supported suffrage, it was the women who led the charge, from Sarah Grimke, a quiet Quaker who wrote the message, to Susan B. Anthony and Abigail Scott Duniway, who spread the word across the land, to Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who shouted from the gates of the White House. The women's voice would not be silenced. What you will hear in this suffrage movement in America is a bare bones rendering of a 72-year-long struggle. Much of this presentation is told in the actual words of the women themselves who spoke them at the time. Our hope is to educate and entertain, and perhaps to pique the interest of the audience to learn more. There are volumes provided on the internet, in libraries, and this year, nearly everywhere you look, for further investigation of the women involved and the movement itself. Of greatest importance is that we not forget nor take for granted what has been won: the right to vote for all American citizens must be safeguarded, encouraged, and employed.
Good evening. The ratification of the 19th Amendment, 1920, granted women in the United States the right to vote. The first presidential election held after that momentous event saw Warren G. Harding and James M. Cox vying for office. In a small farmhouse near Battleground, Washington, Clinton and Lizzie Steele had just returned home from their trip to town to cast their votes. Clinton worked as the town's first postmaster, and Lizzie, who had given birth to 12 children, served as farmer, homemaker, and mother. She was not political, however, she was informed. When Uncle Levi dropped by and was invited in, Clinton proudly announced that he and Lizzie had just been to town to vote. "Yes," he said, "Lizzie and I cast our votes for James M. Cox. Isn't that right, Lizzie?" Lizzie, looking up from her knitting, quietly yet firmly answered, "Speak for yourself, Clinton." From farmhouses in rural America to mansions in our great cities, citizens across our land felt the real power that women gained with the passage of the 19th Amendment. The journey to the voting booth that day was not an easy one. Women and men throughout our nation struggled to gain the right of women to vote, and these brave souls became known as suffragists. We often think that the suffragist movement began at a convention of progressive women in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. However, years before that convention, women, many of whom were also directly involved with the Abolitionist Movement, began writing and publishing papers advocating a woman's right to vote. Two such women were Sarah and Angelina Grimke. Daughters of wealthy slave owners in Charleston, South Carolina, these sisters were to leave the South, move to Philadelphia, become Quakers, and write volumes encouraging the suffragist movement. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah Grimke.
Slavery was a millstone about my neck and marred my comfort from the time I can first remember myself. For my 11th birthday, my father gave me an 11-year-old Negro slave girl, and I tried to give her back. But that was against the rules, so I had to keep her. In secret, I started to teach her to read. But when Father found out, he threatened to whip her, so I stopped. After Father died, I moved to Philadelphia, and I joined the Quakers. My sister Angelina later joined me, and we traveled around New England speaking about abolition of slavery. However, when we started speaking about women's rights, we faced severe criticism for speaking out in public. In 1837, my Letters on the Equality of the Sexes and the Condition of Women was published serially in a Massachusetts newspaper and in book form the following year. I will quote to you from that book. "Intellect is not sexed. Strength of mind is not sexed. And our views about the duties of men and the duties of women, the sphere of man and the sphere of woman, are mere arbitrary opinions, differing in different ages and different countries, dependent solely on the will and judgment of erring mortals." Now, I ask no favors for my sex. I surrender not our claim to equality. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet from off our necks and permit us to stand upright on that ground which God has designed us to occupy. I continued to speak publicly and to publish essays in newspapers. Here's something else I wrote. It would be as wise to set up an accomplished lawyer to saw wood as a business as to condemn an educated and sensible woman to spend all her time boiling potatoes and patching old garments. And yet, this is the lot of many a one who incessantly stitches and boils and bakes, compelled to thrust back out of sight the aspirations which fill her soul. Now, I know nothing of men's rights and women's rights. Human rights, that's all I recognize.
The political climate of the mid-1800s saw great interest in the abolitionist movement, as well as a growing interest in women's rights. By this time, several women were traveling throughout New England, New York, and Pennsylvania advocating for women's rights, and a few were even suggesting that women should be granted the right to vote. In July 1848, a group of 5 activist women, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, gathered in New York to plan the Seneca Falls Convention. Advertised as a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women, this 2-day gathering was initially open only to women. However, after lively discussion, the second day was open to men as well, and one of the participants was the notable former slave, Frederick Douglass. Taking the platform at Seneca Falls was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was strongly influenced by the writings of Sarah Grimke. Stanton prepared and delivered the Declaration of Sentiment speech, which laid the foundation for the entire women's rights movement to follow. By Stanton's side and serving as mentor was Lucretia Mott, a Quaker minister and progressive abolitionist. And Amelia Bloomer, while she did not endorse the Declaration of Sentiments, she did attend the Seneca Falls Convention, and she did cause something of a stir.
Welcome, Mrs. Mott, Mrs. Bloomer. The Seneca Falls Convention looks promising. I'm encouraged by the attendance, and I thank you, Mrs. Mott, for assisting in the planning.
It's my pleasure being here, Mrs. Stanton. It is time to bring to the conscience of our nation the issues that face women today in becoming fully recognized as human beings. Already, I have served for 27 years as a Quaker minister and abolitionist. My husband and I formed the American Anti-Slavery Society, and while I have preached in Negro parishes and organized abolition affairs, fundraising campaigns, I, however, have not been able to speak to mixed crowds of men and women. As a woman abolitionist, I have been threatened, and I have been excluded from participating as a delegate to the anti-slavery conventions simply on the grounds that I am a woman. I meet here today to further the cause of the rights of women, for women to retain their earnings, for women to own property, and for women to retain the custody of their children in the case of divorce. I do not, at this time, agree with the notion of suffrage. However, you may cause me to change my mind. I notice that Amelia Bloomer is here. Why, Mrs. Bloomer, I'm quite offended by your daring outfit.
Good morning, Lucretia. Good morning, Elizabeth. Yes, my costume is causing quite a stir among the ladies on the convention floor. I've explained, and many agree, that the time has come for women to abandon their skirts for a more practical costume that will be far more suited for the work we do. When chopping wood and planting the garden or walking the 4 miles to town for church, and especially when mounting a horse for a longer journey. Why must we be burdened with cumbersome skirts? Why? It is 1848, for heaven's sake. Some of my friends are jokingly referring to my new form of dress as bloomers. I quite like it. Oh, I see that you're being called to the platform, Mrs. Stanton. We shall move to our seats while you present your declaration of sentiments.
The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable rights to the elective franchise. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she has had no voice. He has withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both native and foreigners. Having deprived her of the first right of a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation, he has oppressed her on all sides. He has made her, if married, in the eyes of the law, civilly dead. He has taken from her right in property, even in the wages she earns. In the covenant of marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming, for all intent and purposes, her master. He has so framed the laws of divorce as to what shall be proper causes of divorce in the case of separation, to whom the guardianship of children shall be given. After depriving her of all rights as a married woman, if single and the owner of property, he has taxed her to support a government which recognizes her only when her property can be made profitable to it. He closes against her all avenues of wealth and distinction, which he considers most honorable to himself. As a teacher of theology, medicine, and law, she is not known. He allows her in the church, but only in the subordinate position, claiming apostolic authority over her exclusion from the ministry, and in some exceptions, from public participation in the affairs of the church. He has created a false public sentiment by giving to the world a different code of morals for men and women. He has usurped the prerogative of the Jehovah himself, claiming it is his right to assign her to a sphere of action, when that belongs to her conscience and her God. He has endeavored in every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. Now, in the view of the entire disenfranchisement of one half of the people of this country, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, and because women themselves do feel aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, we insist that we have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of this United States.
The Seneca Falls Convention was attended by 300 people. The Declaration of Sentiments was read and edited several times, with many arguing that the Declaration should not address suffrage, as it would cause a division in the women's movement. It was only when Frederick Douglass spoke eloquently in favor of the suffrage clause that the Declaration finally passed. Douglass projected that the world would be a better place if women were involved in the political sphere. 68 women and 32 men signed the Declaration of Sentiments, and the suffragist movement had officially begun. The newspapers of the day reporting on the convention printed mostly positive reports. However, the Oneida Whig, a newspaper from New York, did not approve of the convention and stated, "This bolt is the most shocking and unnatural incident ever recorded in the history of women. If our ladies will insist on voting and legislating, where, gentlemen, will be our dinners and our elbows? Where will be our domestic firesides and the holes in our stockings?" 2 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Susan B. Anthony. The two were to become close personal friends who collaborated for decades furthering the rights of women.
So good to see you, Susan.
And you, Mrs. Stanton?
I'm remembering all the traveling you did over the years to speak on the abolition of slavery and the need for women's suffrage.
I knew you couldn't travel while you were raising 7 children. Besides, you were a much better writer than I was.
You were a great organizer. When we founded the Women's Loyal National League, we collected nearly 400,000 signatures to end slavery. And after the passage of the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, you helped organize the American Equal Rights Association to give all citizens the right to vote.
Always under your leadership, Mrs. Stanton.
Thank you, Susan. We were a good team.
I began to earn my living as a teacher in 1839 when I was 19. I earned $8 a month, but I found out the male teachers were paid $30 a month, which I thought was unfair, and I said so at teachers' conventions. When I was growing up, our farm was where Quakers in the Rochester area gathered on Sunday afternoons to discuss slavery and how to end it. So it was natural for me to join with other abolitionists and to speak against the evils of slavery. In 1872, along with several other activists, I voted in my hometown of Rochester, New York, and was arrested. While awaiting trial, I spoke publicly and said in part, "To women, this government has no just powers derived from the consent of the governed. To them, this government is not a democracy. It is not a republic. It is an odious aristocracy, a hateful oligarchy of sex. This oligarchy of sex makes father, brothers, husbands, sons, the oligarchs over the mothers and sisters, the wife and daughters of every household. It ordains all men sovereigns, all women subjects." Webster defines a citizen to be a person in the United States entitled to vote and hold office. The only question left to me to settle now is, are women persons? I hardly believe any of our opponents will have the hardihood to say that we are not. Being persons, then women are citizens, and no state has a right to make any law or to enforce any old law that shall abridge their privileges or immunities. At the trial, which got national press coverage, I was found guilty of voting. The judge fined me $100, but I told him I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty, and I didn't. If the judge had ordered me in prison until I paid, I would have appealed my case to the Supreme Court, but he didn't, so I couldn't. During the next 30 years, I traveled and gave many speeches written by Mrs. Stanton on women's rights, especially on the right to vote. I averaged 75 to 100 speeches per year. I went on speaking tours for state suffrage campaigns. In 1871, on my first trip west, I traveled in Oregon, including Union and Baker counties, with Abigail Scott Duniway. In the 1880s, Mrs. Stanton and I started writing the history of women's suffrage. She invited me to bring my trunks and boxes of letters, newspaper clippings, and other material, and live in her house so we could go through the material together and write. When we weren't traveling and giving speeches, I hated writing, but I thought the history needed to be written, and I was getting too old to travel so much. At my 86th birthday celebration in 1906, I spoke of the women who had worked with me for women's rights and said, "With such women consecrating their lives, failure is impossible."
Men had absurd reasons why women shouldn't vote. Women already have the vote since their husbands vote for them. Women's suffrage would destroy marriage. Men are actually the oppressed sex because they do such things as giving women the best seats in a carriage. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were soon joined by Lucy Stone, and the three have been called by some the 19th century triumvirate of women's suffrage and feminism. Although the three women did not always see eye to eye, they worked tirelessly to promote suffrage. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lucy Stone.
Throughout my life, I have often chosen the more challenging path. In fact, some historians have referred to me as America's first independent woman. Although I'm remembered most often for being the first woman in the United States to keep her own name after marriage, I did achieve a number of additional firsts to forward the rights of women, for which I am humbly proud. Mrs. Stanton once wrote that Lucy Stone was the first speaker who really stirred the nation's heart on the subject of women's wrongs. I was born on a small farm in Massachusetts in 1818, the 8th of 9 children. When I turned 13, my father decided that it was time for me to quit school and stay home to help Mother with the chores. He said, "School for girls is a complete waste of money. Your sisters know a woman's place, so should you." When my father would not support my desire for an education, I alternated my own education with teaching jobs to earn enough to continue. When my father, a teacher, fell ill, I taught his classes for a term. I was paid $1 a week, whereas my brother had been paid $7 a week. When I asked the school board why, they said that I was being paid woman's wages. Why is that? The flour merchant, the house builder, and the postman charge us no less on account of our sex. But when we endeavor to earn money to pay for their services, then indeed we find the difference. I attended Oberlin College in Ohio, the country's first college to admit both women and Negroes. I entered the college believing that women should be able to vote and assume political office, that women should study the classic professions, and that women should be able to speak their minds in a public forum. Oberlin College did not share all of these sentiments. Because it was considered inappropriate for women to participate in oral exercises with men, I organized an off-campus women's debate club to help women develop their public speaking skills. Our debates attracted much attention and were later banned by Oberlin's faculty board. I was later asked to write a commencement speech for my graduating class, but I refused because a man would have had to have read my speech. I could not support a principle that denied women the privilege of being co-laborers with men in a sphere to which their ability makes them adequate. In 1847, when I graduated from Oberlin, I became the first woman from the state of Massachusetts to earn a college degree. I later gave a public address from the pulpit of my brother's church in Gardner, Massachusetts. This led the American Anti-Slavery Society to hire me as a public speaker. I was one of the first women to step out of the traditional, behind-the-scenes woman's sphere and to take to the public stage, lecturing on both abolitionism and women's rights. I continued to speak out against slavery and advocate for women's rights. I delivered a speech entitled, "Disappointment is the Lot of Women," at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, and organized the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1850. In 1851, Sojourner Truth, a free woman, gave what became known as her "Ain't I a Woman?" speech at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio.
Indeed, Sojourner Truth, a freed slave, forwarded the causes of abolition and suffrage. Hers was a strong voice for freedom for all. In her 1851 address, she said, "If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full?" Then that little man in black there, he says that women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they're asking to do it, and the men better let them. During the Civil War, many of the men and women who had become involved in suffrage turned their attention and energies to the Abolitionist Movement. The momentum of the previous decade was lost to war and Reconstruction. However, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, Lucretia Mott, Amelia Bloomer, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, and many more activists continued to speak out for the rights of women, especially the right of women to vote. From 1868 to 1870, the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution provided voting rights for freed male slaves and equal rights without regard to color, while pointedly neglecting the issue of sex. Women were still not allowed to vote. While many suffragists, including Mrs. Stanton and Miss Anthony, believed that the only way to full suffrage was through a federal constitutional amendment, another faction felt that suffrage would best be won at the state level. For a time, the movement splintered, but in 1890, two strong women's organizations merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, with Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucy Stone at the helm. While the suffrage movement in the East struggled to gain momentum, in the West, in places like Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and Montana, a new spirit was evolving, and the suffrage movement began to take on an energy not yet seen in the eastern states. Abigail Scott traveled on the Oregon Trail, arriving in Lafayette, Oregon, near McMinnville, in 1852 at the age of 17. She would marry Benjamin Charles Duniway and go on to become mother, teacher, store owner, newspaper publisher, and Western leader of the women's suffrage movement. Today, Abigail Scott Duniway is a name familiar to many who live and vote in Oregon.
I was 17 in 1852 when my family immigrated from Illinois to Oregon by ox-drawn wagon. And I will tell you, it was a hard trip. Mother passed early in the journey. And then little brother Willie died and was buried near here, above Burnt River. The rest of us reached the Willamette Valley and settled in Lafayette, near McMinnville. I soon got a job teaching in Eola, just west of Salem, and I met Benjamin Duniway, and we were married. We farmed near Lafayette, but during rainy winters, I wrote a novel called Captain Gray's Company, and it was published in 1859, the very first book commercially published in Oregon. My husband had co-signed a note for a friend. But when that note came due in 1862, we didn't have the cash to pay it, so our farm was taken in payment. Ben got a job working for another farmer, but soon after that, he was involved in an accident with a runaway team, and he was permanently disabled. So I had to support our family, which included 4 children. I opened a small boarding school in Lafayette. I ran that for 4 years. I taught for a year at a private school in Albany, and then I opened up a millinery shop in Albany, and I ran that for 5 years. My experiences in business, as well as the stories my customers told me about their injustices and mistreatments, showed me the need for laws to allow married women to own and control property. In 1871, Ben got a job with the U.S. Customs Service in Portland, so we moved our now 6 children there. I founded a weekly newspaper called The New Northwest. It included fashion and domestic advice, as you might expect, as well as politics and the need for women's rights, including property rights and suffrage. I continued to write novels, and I serialized them in my newspaper, which I edited for 16 years. Soon after our move to Portland, I met with Susan B. Anthony, who was making her first tour of the Pacific Northwest. And we agreed that I would manage her speaking tour, introduce her before each speech, and we would share the income. Miss Anthony was a wonderful teacher on organizing for women's rights, and we became friends. In 1873, I helped found the Oregon State Woman Suffrage Association, and I began traveling all around Oregon as well as elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest, lecturing on the need for women to have legal rights. 10 years later, 10 long years later, the Oregon legislature passed a constitutional amendment to eliminate the word male from the section on elections. But the male electorate voted it down. I was asked to refute 10 reasons some men gave for opposing women's suffrage. So I wrote, in part, if women don't want to vote, they needn't. There's no law to compel them to vote. How do you know they would neglect their homes if they were to vote? Are all the men who vote vagabonds? Later, I sold my newspaper, and we moved our family to Idaho, where we lived on a ranch for 8 years. But when we moved back to Oregon, I found the suffrage movement had nearly collapsed. So I helped other women establish the Oregon State Equal Suffrage Association. The Oregon legislature passed another suffrage amendment, which went on the ballot in 1900. All of the newspapers in the state supported it, except the Oregonian. My brother, Harvey Scott, was the editor of that paper, and he wrote editorials in opposition of that amendment, which was defeated.
After the 1906 defeat, Alice Blackwell explained in her Women's Journal that the suffrage measure had come so close to passing in 1900 that before the subsequent elections, the liquor interests, the political machines of both parties, the trusts and corporations, together with the natural forces of conservatism and $250,000, made a combination too strong for the women to overcome. Mrs. Blackwell added, trusts and large corporations, which would gladly deprive most men of a vote if they could, did not want to have any more voters to deal with. In 1911, a committee of Portland Women Club members took the lead to build support for a fourth suffrage initiative to be voted on in Oregon in 1912. They got all the groups involved that had worked for suffrage in previous years. They printed pamphlets, had a speakers bureau, held tea parties and luncheons and evening meetings. A pro-suffrage float won first prize in the 1912 Rose Festival Parade.
Even the Oregonian supported the measure in 1912. I assume that's because my brother had died the previous year. But I was in poor health, and I could no longer give speeches. However, in October, the suffragist organizers held a well-publicized birthday banquet in my honor, and I did attend in my wheelchair. On Election Day in November 1912, the women's suffrage amendment finally passed. The county clerk brought the voter registration book to my house so that I could be the first woman to register to vote in Multnomah County. And I got to vote in the 1912 Oregon election.
Oh, Abigail, thank you for all your hard work and dedication that has made this day possible. You are truly an inspiration for all women.
The world and the suffrage movement in particular lost a mighty force when, by 1915, all the mothers of the American suffrage movement had died. From 1900 to 1915, however, three dynamic figures would appear on the scene to lead the country to the passage of the 19th Amendment, otherwise known as the Anthony Amendment, granting women in the United States the right to vote. Along with many others, Lucy Burns, Alice Paul, and Carrie Chapman Catt led the way in the 20th century fight for women's suffrage. While many states, especially in the West, were beginning to grant women's suffrage on a state level, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, headed by Susan B. Anthony, was struggling in the post-Civil War era. Meanwhile, Americans Alice Paul and Lucy Burns were working for the suffrage movement in England. Upon their return to the United States by 1912, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns began working for the National American Women's Suffrage Association, but their approach to suffrage became far more militant than this country had yet seen. By organizing parades and demonstrations in front of the White House, they brought publicity to the movement and gave it a fresh momentum. Lucy Burns became one of the most significant leaders of the women's suffrage movement in the United States.
I've been arrested 6 times in this country, and I've spent more time in prison than any other suffragist. I'm proud of it. I co-founded the National Women's Party with Alice Paul. I've organized several campaigns in the West, served as editor of the I've organized several campaigns in the West, served as editor of the newspaper The Suffragist, and orchestrated pickets and protests in front of the White House. Many in this country believe that suffrage must be won at the state level. The state level was not good enough, my friends. Our own President Wilson said that he supported suffrage, but his actions belie these words, as he ignored our requests and plainly stated that he would not impose his views on Congress. It is true that I've been referred to as organized and diplomatic, yet I strongly believe that the only way to gain suffrage was with a federal amendment. To that end, I condemned the apathy of the Democratic Party and the hypocrisy of President Wilson. So, in 1916, I, along with 4 other women, took our seats in the front row of the visitors' gallery during President Wilson's address to Congress, whereupon we unfurled a banner that read, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" The following month, I began picketing the White House, once holding a large banner before the Russian envoys that stated, "We, the women of America, tell you that America is not a democracy. 20 million American women, 20 million American citizens are denied the right to vote. President Wilson is the chief opponent of their national enfranchisement. Tell our government it must liberate its people before it can claim free Russia as an ally." As a result of these protests, I have been arrested many times, and on one occasion, I was sent to the Occoquan workhouse, where I was beaten, tied up, and force-fed as the guards held me down and shoved a tube up my nose. This unconscionable evening, in which many women were beaten and victimized, has become known as the Night of Terror.
Lucy Burns certainly suffered brutality at the hands of prison guards, but she was not alone. Working very closely with Lucy Burns was Alice Paul, who became far more militant, dramatic, and confrontational, especially at the nation's capital.
I already been arrested, suffered hunger strikes, and been force-fed in England before I returned to the United States. Nothing was more important to me than suffrage. Looking back, I must say it is ridiculous to think that by the early 20th century, women who were no longer confined to hearth and home, women who were employed, women who took the place of men in steel mills and oil refineries during this war, These same women were denied the most fundamental right of any citizen in a democracy, the right to vote. In 1913, my friend Lucy Burns and I organized a massive suffrage parade on Pennsylvania Avenue the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. 4 years later, we took our campaign to the White House. We called ourselves the Silent Sentinels. We were the first protesters ever to picket the White House. Our banner spoke directly to Woodrow Wilson.
Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? We politically decried President Wilson's hypocrisy as he called for world democracy while still denying suffrage to women at home. World War I had begun, and many believed us suffragists to be disloyal. Disloyal? We just wanted the right to vote. Still, mobs of citizens as well as police continued to attack us during our protests.
We were indeed jailed, beaten, and force-fed during our hunger strikes. At one point, I was confined to a psychiatric ward. Our efforts did not go unnoticed as tension grew between the suffragists who were gaining in number and the White House. President Wilson came to understand that something had to be done and turned quickly to end the protests.
While Lucy Burns and Alice Paul were presenting the militant face of the suffrage movement, Carrie Chapman Catt worked in a more traditional way. As president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Catt unveiled her winning plan in 1916. Her goal was to work on both the state and federal level as she lobbied to gain support from both the U.S. House and the Senate. In 1917, Carrie Chapman Catt delivered a message to Congress.
Excerpts from my message to Congress. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana and gentlemen, do you realize that in no other country in the world with democratic tendencies is suffrage so completely denied as in a considerable number of our own states? There's 13 southern states with no suffrage for women, and 14 others where suffrage for women is more limited than in many foreign countries. Do you realize that when you ask women to take their cause to the state referendum, you compel them to do this? That you drive women of education, refinement, achievement to beg men who cannot read for their political freedom? Do you realize that such anomalies as a college professor asking her janitor to give her a vote are overstraining the patience and driving women to desperation? Do you realize that women in increasing numbers indignantly resent the long delay in their enfranchisement? There is one thing mightier than kings and armies, Congress and political parties, the power of an idea when its time has come. The time for women's suffrage has come. The women's hour has struck. If parties prefer to postpone action longer and thus do battle with this idea, they challenge the inevitable. The idea will not perish. The party which opposes it may. Every delay, every trick, every political dishonesty from now on will antagonize women of the land more and more. And when the party or parties which have such delayed women's suffrage finally let it come, their sincerity will be doubted and their appeal to the new voters will be met with suspicion. This is the psychology of the situation. Can you afford the risk? Think it over. Some of you hold to the doctrine of states' rights as applying to women's suffrage. Adherence to that theory will keep the United States far behind all other democratic nations upon this question. A theory which prevents a nation from keeping up with the trend of the world's progress cannot be justified. Gentlemen and lady, we hereby petition you, our only designated representatives, to redress our grievances by the immediate passage of the federal suffrage amendment, and to use your influence to secure the ratification in your own state, in order that the women of our nation be endowed with political freedom before the next presidential election, and that our nation may resume its world leadership in democracy. Women's suffrage is coming. You know it. Will you, honorable senators and members of Congress, members of the House of Representatives, help or hinder?
What began in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 with a small group of activist women would end in Washington, D.C. on August 26, 1920, with the passage of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Also known as the Anthony Amendment, it gave women in this country their right to cast a vote. It was men who cast the ballots to enfranchise women. It was women who were unjustly jailed and tormented with force-feeding and other inequalities, but still persisted. The all-male vote, no women were in Congress at the time, was 304 in favor and 89 against in the House of Representatives. The Senate voted 56 yes and 25 nay. The struggle was long and hard-fought, but it wasn't quite over. The amendment still faced ratification by at least 36 of the 48 states. In March of 1920, 35 states had ratified. Finally, on August 18, 1920, Tennessee voted for ratification. Other states were to vote on ratification throughout the 20th century, and by 1971, almost all the states had voted to allow women the right to vote. Mississippi ratified the 19th Amendment in 1984, 64 years after the law was enacted. The organization called the National Women's Suffrage Association, headed by Carrie Chapman Catt, was to become the League of Women Voters, which remains very active to this day. Today, let us be grateful to the women of yesteryear, to Sarah Grimke and Lucretia Mott, to Amelia Bloomer and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone and Sojourner Truth, to Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, to Carrie Chapman Catt and Abigail Scott Duniway. Abigail looked to the future.
The young women of today, free to study, to speak, to write, to choose their own occupation, should remember that every inch of this freedom was bought for them at a great price. It is for them to show their gratitude by helping onward the reforms of their own times, by spreading the light of freedom and truth still wider. The debt that each generation owes to the past, it must pay to the future.
My name is Jean Simpson. My mother was 17 when this amendment passed. I am of the first generation in my family to be born with the right to vote.
My name is Judy Head. We've come a long ways. We still have a long ways to go. The men of America helped us get to where we are today. We still need your help. we still are fighting the battle of fair wages.
I'm Kirsten Badger. I was the first woman to wear pants to work at Stanford Medical Center, 1970.
I'm Judy Baker, and when I was in college, women finally got the right to have their names, their own name, on a credit card.
I'm Ginger Savage, and I graduated from high school in 1984, 36 years ago, when Mississippi was the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment.
I'm Betsy Ferns, and I'm the first woman in my family who became an actress.
I'm Wanda Raffety, and I was the first one in my family to graduate from college.
I'm Joyce Hunsaker. I'm the first female in my family to create and own my own business in my own name.
I'm Mickey Edwards. When I was 11, some boys told me I could never grow up to become president because I was a girl. I hit them with my lunch pail, broke my thermos.
I'm Colbi Bachman, and I'll be able to vote in 2027.
So, with many, many thanks to all of our readers, and with a special shout out to our narrator, Dave Hunsaker. Sorry, breaks me up every time. And to you, our audiences, wherever you may be when you see this. We also want to say thank you to Baker Branch AAUW, who made it possible for us to do this. And COVID intervened, but it didn't stop the women or the narrator. Have a good day.